Each year, during hunting season, I make it a point to travel up to the northern part of the state for a hunting trip. Since I can't afford to own a property just for one trip each year, I usually rent an Airbnb cabin. This also makes sense because I'm still learning the ropes when it comes to hunting. Some years, I'd go with my uncle, but as his health deteriorated, I started going alone more frequently. The last time I went hunting was in 2022, the year I'm writing about. In November, I rented a cabin in a secluded area near a national park. I arrived late on a Friday evening after finishing work and driving up, and when I reached the long, private dirt road leading to the cabin, it was pitch black outside. The silence was deafening. No crickets, no wildlife, just a chilling, dead stillness. The place was remote, so it made sense that it would be so quiet. I parked as close as I could to the cabin. The host had told me the key would be hidden under the mat, and sure enough, there it was. I brought my 2 bags inside and unpacked in the cozy 1-bedroom cabin. The owner had already turned the heat on for me, which was a relief since it can get pretty cold up there in November. The cabin had both cable and Wi-Fi, so I set an alarm for an early start to my hunt the next morning. As far as I'm concerned, dawn is the best time to find deer, or if you're lucky, a moose. I woke up to my alarm and was out in the woods in less than 30 minutes. Since I wasn't familiar with the area, I set up behind a fallen tree, hoping for the best. I hadn't been sitting there long when I heard a man's voice from behind me, and I jumped, startled. Turning around, I saw a man with graying hair, but who looked around 50 years old. He approached slowly and demanded, "What the hell are you doing here?" Confused, I said, "Excuse me?" He snapped back, "Hunting is restricted here." I didn't know that. I explained this to him, but he seemed angry, telling me he'd seen me drive up and that people like me were always coming from out of town and didn't respect the rules. He ordered me to leave, so I apologized and packed up to head back. When I turned around to walk away, the man had disappeared. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was unsettling. I decided to drive to another park, one I found online that allowed hunting. The rest of the morning didn't go much better, and by midday, I went back to the cabin to regroup and have lunch. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before. Inside, I felt like things had been moved around and the zipper on my bag was unzipped. I couldn't remember whether I'd left it open or not, but I always kept my bag zipped. I checked the rooms quickly, then decided I was too hungry to worry about it, so I drove to a nearby village for some Chinese takeout. I ate my meal in the cabin and then took a short nap. Later, I headed back to the park to try my luck again. I spent a quiet hour walking slowly through the woods, hoping to spot something, but no luck. As dusk began to fall, I packed up and drove back to the cabin. I cooked myself a pasta dinner, watching TV in the background, and then sat down on the small love seat, thinking about how strange the door incident was. I wondered if I was just imagining things or if something had actually happened. After brushing my teeth, I lay in bed, starting to doze off to another movie. I was nearly asleep when I heard the distinct sound of a door clicking open. This snapped me awake, and I noticed that the closet door in my bedroom was now cracked open. That was it. I was wide awake and immediately grabbed my hunting bag to get my CZ-75 pistol. With the gun in hand, I turned on the bedroom light and pointed the barrel at the closet. I yelled, "Come out now, or I'll shoot." I was still in disbelief that someone could be in there, but my instinct was to be cautious. To my shock, the closet door creaked open, and the same man I'd encountered earlier stepped out. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, missing a front tooth. He smugly said, "You got me." I kept the gun trained on him and pulled out my phone to call 911. I had service out there. I informed the sheriff's department that I was armed and had the intruder at gunpoint. It felt like an eternity before the deputies arrived. During that wait, the man ranted about how he was sick of people like me disrespecting the parks. I didn't engage with him and just kept telling him to shut up. When the deputies arrived, they arrested him for breaking and entering, though I didn't think he had stolen anything. The man claimed the door had been unlocked, but I wasn't so sure. He might have picked the lock or even climbed through a window. The Airbnb host seemed more concerned about whether any of his things were missing than about apologizing for the situation. He said he didn't know who the man was, even after the deputies identified him. In the end, I didn't leave the door unlocked, but thankfully, I had my gun with me, and the situation didn't escalate any further. If I hadn't been on a hunting trip and had my firearms with me, I'm not sure how things would have gone. When I was 14, it was my first year hunting deer with my family, specifically my father and cousin. To give you a sense of the setup, my hunting blind was 2 miles south of my father's stand, which was located 9 miles southwest of the camp. We used a four-wheeler to get within about 100 yards of his stand, which still left me with quite a bit of walking to do before reaching mine. I live in the northern part of Wisconsin, where winters come fast and the days grow short quickly. It was around 4 p.m. when I started feeling the chill and decided it was time to pack up my blind. I had a .243 rifle with a pink camouflage cover and a strap, so I could carry it on my back. I zipped up the blind, disposed of my trash in a bucket, and was just finishing when I heard a couple of leaves rustling nearby. I immediately turned my head, hoping it was a deer, but after waiting a moment, I dismissed it as just a squirrel or a bird. Feeling disappointed, I finished closing my blind and began heading toward my father's stand. As I took my first few steps out, I noticed something odd. A fresh path had been cut through the leaves. It was far too wide to be the work of a small animal, or even a deer. My mind immediately jumped to thoughts of a bear or a wolf, so I started walking faster, heading toward my father. The sky was quickly darkening, and I was still about a mile away from my dad. Anxiety began to creep in as I picked up the pace, when suddenly, I was stopped in my tracks by one of the most terrifying noises I've ever heard. The best way I can describe it is like a bear or some kind of man being murdered. The sound echoed across the woods, coming from about 150 yards away. Fear shot through me as I immediately started running, but the thick hunting gear I was wearing, along with the 20-pound pack on my back, made it difficult to keep up any real speed. After about 25 seconds of running, I heard the noise again, this time much louder and closer. I kept going, my heart racing. The world around me had gone pitch black, save for the moonlight above. As I ran, I couldn't help but feel something was following me. I finally reached the point where I turned around, switching on my headlamp. What I saw still haunts me to this day. About 50 yards away, I saw a dark figure standing in the woods, illuminated by the moonlight. It was tall at least 10 feet and thin, almost unnaturally so. My breath caught in my throat, and without a second thought, I sprinted forward trying to get my rifle off my back. I didn't know where I was running. I just knew I had to keep moving. Somehow, I ended up on Rabbit Road, a dirt road that connected my camp to the hunting area entrance. I continued down the road until I finally saw the cabin in the distance. When I reached the steps of my cabin, I turned around once more. It was there again, but this time farther away. The same tall, black, thin figure stood motionless in the darkness. Its long limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally. As I collapsed onto the steps in exhaustion, I vomited for about a minute before passing out from the combination of fear and exertion. I woke up to the sound of my dad's four-wheeler coming up the driveway. The moment I saw him, I rushed toward him, crying uncontrollably. I hugged him tight and quickly recounted everything that had happened, explaining how I'd run all the way back without stopping. At first, he didn't believe me, but as we settled inside the cabin, he saw the desperation in my eyes, and I think he finally understood. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for weeks after, and the fear never really went away. People told me it was probably just a bear or that I was seeing things, but I know what I saw. To this day, I'm older, and I only go hunting with someone else. I also carry a bigger gun now for reassurance, in case I ever encounter something like that again. As I write this, that night remains the scariest experience of my life. It was a Friday evening, and I had just returned home from school. I was 13 years old and couldn't contain my excitement about going hunting. I loved hunting, especially at the ranch we frequented in Alice, Texas. I had been going there since I was 4 years old, and the place was filled with memories. My grandpa, dad, and I would always go together, and sometimes the ranch owner's family would join us as well. It was deer season, my favorite time of year. The thrill of seeing a big buck right in front of you is a feeling like no other, And of course, the satisfaction of taking the shot. Some people say hunting is wrong, but I believe if you're hunting for food and eating what you catch, then it's part of life. We arrived at the ranch around 10 p.m., and by that time, it was pitch dark. The ranch spans about 300 acres, and the campsite is a small, old shack, roughly the size of a bedroom. While there is electricity, it's far from the large cabins where many hunters stay. The shack does have a few beds, but one time when I was younger, my dad found a huge snake shed in one of them, so we started sleeping in a tent. The camp is surrounded by woods with a small open field just ahead, about the size of a football field, which we often use for dove hunting. After unloading the gear, we sat around the campfire, laughing and telling jokes, when suddenly we heard a scream. It was unlike any sound I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal sound, but something far more disturbing, almost like a human hybrid. The scream echoed through the night, not too far away, and instantly, everyone at the camp froze. I could see the fear in their eyes. The ranch owner, an older man in his 70s, was the first to speak, asking, "What the hell was that?" He told us, along with one of his family members, to go check it out, as he was too old to do it himself. We took my grandpa's ATV and did a quick search around the perimeter, but we found nothing. Even though we didn't find anything, I couldn't shake the terror I felt from hearing that scream. It stuck with me, and even though it was just an hour or so before dawn, I was still terrified. I went to bed with my gun right beside me, not being able to fall asleep for a while. When the alarm went off, I got ready to hunt, but the thought of being alone in the dark haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the scream that still echoed in my head. My grandpa dropped me off at the blind, and as always, he wasn't the type to coddle me. He expected me to figure things out on my own, so he left me in the dark, and I had to find my way up to the blind by myself. I climbed up the ladder and settled into the blind, waiting for the sun to rise. It was still pitch dark, and I had about 20 minutes to kill. That's when I noticed something strange in the middle of the trail. At first, I couldn't make it out clearly, but then I remembered the night vision scope my uncle had given me, so I decided to give it a try. Excited to possibly spot a big deer, I looked through the night vision, but what I saw still haunts me. Instead of a deer, I saw a person walking toward the woods. But it didn't look like a normal person. It was distorted, and its outline was wrong. I don't know how it noticed me, but the moment I looked through the scope, it turned and stared directly at me. The fear that gripped me in that moment is indescribable. I could feel my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. Then it happened. The thing gave out the same exact blood-curdling scream I had heard the night before, but this time, it was louder. My mind went into complete panic mode. I grabbed my .22 rifle and started firing. I unloaded the entire clip into the path where it had been standing. In a daze, I quickly grabbed my bigger rifle, a .243, and fired 4 rounds into the same area. The fear was so overwhelming that I didn't even think twice. After a moment of silence, I looked back through the night vision scope, but the figure was gone. I was still shaking when I started receiving texts and calls, mostly from my dad. I quickly told him what happened, and he confirmed that he and my grandpa had heard the scream too. We all agreed it was something we couldn't explain, but it still didn't feel right. The hunt was never the same after that night. I always went hunting with my dad after that, scared that whatever I saw might return. The most chilling part? Despite firing 25 rounds from the .22 and 4 from the .243, when we went to check the area, there were no signs of blood, no footprints, nothing. It was as if whatever that thing was had simply vanished. It was still dark when I fired all those shots, but I know that at least one of those rounds must have hit it. I don't know what I encountered that night, but whatever it was, it didn't feel like anything human. To this day, I still hunt at that ranch, but I never go alone anymore. I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night might still be out there, waiting. It was the fall of 1986, and I was 23 years old. I had never really been afraid of the woods before. In fact, I always considered the wilderness my safe haven, a place where I could escape the stresses of everyday life. Growing up, I'd never encountered anything unusual, like a Bigfoot, skinwalker, or any sort of mythical creature. I had been working as a lineman in a small town in eastern Tennessee, a job where you had to wear many hats, including handling utility disconnects. It wasn't fun, but it was part of the job. Even though the work was crazy, I never had anything bizarre happen to me in the woods. Back then, my main hobbies were hunting and fishing. In this area, finding a good hunting spot wasn't hard. Most landowners were eager to have the deer population thinned out because the deer were destroying crops like young soybeans. Since the region had been heavily affected by strip mining in the 50s, a lot of land was left unusable for farming or building. As a result, much of it remained open for hunting. It was October 1986, and daylight saving time had not yet taken place, so it was still light out well after 7 p.m. I left work around 4, quickly changed into my camo at home, and headed out to hunt. It was bow season, which was my favorite. I was planning to hunt in a special spot I had, an area I'll call Ridge, which was a secluded area filled with broken farmland and thick wooded patches. When I arrived at my spot, I decided not to unload my three-wheeler, but instead walk the 3/4 of a mile to the place I intended to hunt. I was using a summit climbing stand, so I had to carry my stand, bow, and a fanny pack containing my knife and flashlight. I had to walk halfway around a cornfield that hadn't yet been harvested, staying in the lane the farmer had cleared for his equipment to enter the field. The field itself was rectangular, with a higher end at the top and a creek running across the bottom, where the water was about shin deep. At the top corner of the field was where I would enter the woods. I fought my way through a thick blackberry thicket, eventually finding a game trail that led me through. It opened into a hillside full of large trees. I found a suitable tree for my climbing stand, and after a short climb, I was settled in. The views from 20 feet up were amazing. I loved being in nature. Hunting was just an excuse to experience it. At 5:30 p.m., I was ready to begin. I had an arrow nocked, and I made sure to set up late to avoid spooking any nearby deer. I had marked the trail with reflective tape, which helped me find my way back at night. At 8 p.m., with the full moon rising, I decided to head down as the deer hunting for the day was over. As I was carefully descending, I heard a loud crashing sound. It was a deer, startled by my movement. I secured my stand and bow, turned on my flashlight, and began walking back toward the direction I had entered from. The woods looked different in the dark, and walking into the thicket felt even stranger with the flashlight illuminating the way. After some time, I couldn't find my original trail, and by 9 p.m., I was ready to get out. I started walking through the thicket, keeping the moon on my right, until I finally emerged into the field about 25 yards from where I had entered. As I stood there, pulling thorns from my legs and hands, I looked around the field. The pale moonlight lit the area, and that's when I saw it. The trail I had walked earlier was now blocked by something massive. What I had assumed was a shadow was now a distinct, dark shape standing in the middle of the field trail. It was too tall to be a person. I had no idea what it was, but it was 6 feet wide and at least 6 feet tall. Without hesitation, I began walking toward it, hoping it was just a strange shadow or optical illusion. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't just a shadow. At 100 yards, it still hadn't moved, and I had no idea what I was walking into. As I got closer, the figure started to take shape. It wasn't one entity, but two, standing side by side, almost like they were waiting for something. I started to feel uneasy, more than just a strange feeling in my gut. It was 9:15 p.m. and around 40 degrees out. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in the middle of nowhere. I kept walking, thinking to myself that they must be lost or something. When I was about 20 yards away, I could make out the figures more clearly. It was a young man and a woman, both probably around 20 years old. But there was something unsettling about the way they stood. No words, no movement, just staring blankly ahead. I said to them, "Kind of cold out here, isn't it?" But they didn't respond. They just stood there. I kept walking, glancing back a few times. They didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. I crossed the creek and walked toward my truck. At this point, I was feeling a strong sense of unease, but I tried to brush it off. As I neared the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was eerie. I carefully approached the vehicle, keeping my eyes on the surroundings. I stood there for a few minutes, observing it quietly before deciding it was safe to approach. But something still didn't feel right. When I finally got into my truck and drove off, I couldn't help but wonder how those two had gotten out there. I hadn't seen any vehicles. I tried to let it go, but the next day, something happened that made me think twice. While getting lunch during work, I noticed all 4 of my truck's tires were low. After closer inspection, I found around 10 to 15 roofing nails in each tire. I had to put tubes in them to make it back home. It became clear someone had punctured my tires while my truck was parked out there. I knew it had to have happened while I was in the woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever those 2 people were, they had something to do with it. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me when I hunted in that area. I never went back alone again and never parked off the main gravel road. To this day, I've never figured out who those 2 were or why they were out there, and I've never found out who sabotaged my tires. But something about those woods changed for me after that night. It may sound like a scene from a movie, but this truly happened to me about 24 years ago. When I was still a relatively new bride, my then husband and I moved into a townhouse-style apartment. Our unit spanned the 2nd and 3rd floors of the building, while the management office and mailboxes were located almost directly below us on the ground floor. This detail becomes important later. The building manager was an older woman who didn't maintain the property well and spent most of her days chain-smoking Camel non-filters in her office. She was an unpleasant, hateful person and frankly a racist. Imagine Juno, the social worker from Beetlejuice, but even less helpful. She clearly resented us for having the townhouse, accusing us of lying about my pregnancy at the time we moved in. She claimed she wouldn't have rented that unit to a family with children. On top of that, she made several bigoted remarks about my husband due to his race. She was, without a doubt, a gem of a human being. After our child was born, I became a stay-at-home mom. My days were filled with keeping the house in order and caring for the baby. Without a car or nearby mom friends, my world revolved around the apartment. One afternoon, after lunch, my 9-month-old was covered in the predictable chaos of baby food, so I went upstairs to run a bath. Soon, the baby was happily splashing in one of those suction cup bath seats. Here's something crucial to note. It was the dead of winter, and we had no heat, a problem I'd been battling Juno over for quite some time. This was just one of the many maintenance issues plaguing the apartment, alongside a dangerously sparking ceiling fan and a duct-taped garbage disposal that constantly leaked. We relied on space heaters in every room to keep from freezing. On this particular day, I'd brought a space heater into the bathroom to warm it up for bath time, placing it securely on the counter, out of the baby's reach and well away from any splashing. I was standing in the tub, getting ready to lift the baby out when something unexpected happened. The space heater began rocking back and forth, a motion it hadn't made previously. A sudden, awful sense of dread washed over me as I stared at it. There was no time to think. I knew I couldn't get both myself and the baby out of harm's way in time. Instinct took over. I grabbed the baby's seat, yanked it up, and lifted the baby out. I dropped the baby, seat and all, onto the bathroom floor just as the heater reached the end of its cord. It thumped against the shower door, bounced off the edge of the tub, and landed on its side a few inches away. Luckily, the heater had a built-in safety feature that shut it off when tipped over. That's when things got even stranger. I looked toward the corner of the bathroom and noticed the space there becoming unnaturally dark. It wasn't smoke, there were no visible changes to the lighting, and the bathroom didn't have windows, so there were no shadows from outside. It was as if the shadows themselves were thickening in that one spot. Then the smell hit me. It was the distinct, suffocating odor of Camel non-filters. A smell I knew all too well from being in Juno's office. The scent was so overpowering it made me cough and caused my chest to ache. Yet, there was no visible smoke. Along with the smell came a deeply unsettling sensation, like pure hatred and malice aimed directly at me. It felt as though someone were standing there, glaring at me with a ferocious intensity. I grabbed the baby, wrapped him in a towel, and bolted downstairs. I was so shaken I couldn't bring myself to go back upstairs. Instead, I made do with some diapers from the diaper bag and kept the baby bundled in the towel, holding him close for warmth. We stayed downstairs for the rest of the day, the memory of what had just happened playing on a loop in my mind. Every so often, I'd glance nervously up the stairs, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching from the bathroom. When my husband finally got home, he noticed the baby wasn't dressed and asked why. I told him everything: the heater rocking, the smoke smell, and the shadows in the bathroom. Skeptical, he went upstairs to check, assuming it was just another maintenance issue. However, he found nothing. The outlet was fine, there was no smoke or cigarette smell, and the heater was sitting upright on the counter. He turned it on and watched it for a while, but it didn't rock or show any signs of malfunction. He dismissed it, chalking it up to my imagination, but later that evening, we overheard Juno's adult son yelling near the mailboxes downstairs. That's when we learned what had happened earlier that day. Juno had suffered a massive heart attack in her office and died. Her son had found her slumped in her chair, a Camel non-filter still clutched in her hand.